Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone joining us today for the very first session of the 21st Century Learning Online Conference. We appreciate you taking some time for your day to join with us with Jennifer Chang-Lottle, who is going to be talking to us today about mathematics. Jennifer is an author, educational consultant, and part-time instructor for the University of Hong Kong with 25 years experience in the education field. She's been a keynoter and a workshop leader for us for many years in face-to-face events and is a very well-known face in Hong Kong and around the region for all of her work in conceptual-based learning of mathematics and more recently with a lot of her work in terms of teaching online and teaching online and learning in the new world that we've been in for the past year. So I'm very pleased and honored to welcome Jennifer to lead us through this very first conference session. With that, I'll hand over to her and you'll see me again at the end when we get to the Q&A portion of the session. So please drop any questions you might have in the chat area of this Zoom webinar. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much, Justin, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you, 21st Century Learning, for inviting me to share my thoughts with you today. It is an honor. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank everyone also for joining me today to discuss this very important topic of engaging the minds, hearts, and souls of our students when learning mathematics. Now, I'd like to start off with a little story that is mostly true, let's say. The story begins with a Hong Kong taxi and a lovely Hong Kong taxi driver called Sam. So many years ago, I used to work at this wonderful school called South Island School here in Hong Kong. And every morning I would get up and Sam, the taxi driver, would pick me up from home and take me to school. He even waited sometimes for me at the end of the day and would take me home if he was still on duty. Sam actually knew me before I had my children, so I have 20-year-olds now. And he also knew me before I was married, and he used to pick me up from home, take me to school for a good 10 years. Here is a picture of a window of my apartment that I used to live in, and this is what the view was like. Now, Hong Kong roads are very peculiar in that you can only drive to the right and you can only drive down if you're looking at Hong Kong from a grid. So this means that if my school was here, you have one route to get to school, which is here. We can actually go to the right. Now, if school was actually here down, then there would also be one route because, you know, our roads are quite peculiar. We can only move to the right and we can only move down. Now, what about if school was here? You can see that any position where the school is to the right, there'll always be one route. And you can also see that if the school was below my home, that any position below, there would always be one route as well. Now, what if South Island School was here? So just use your fingers to trace on the screen how many routes you think there are. Feel free to put it in the chat box as well. Justin, let me know if anyone's put anything in the chat box. How many routes to school if South Island School was here from my home? Anyone in the chat box at the moment? Hopefully everyone just traced that there were two routes here. And if South Island School was here, just use your fingers to trace how many routes there would be here. Let me get up the chat box and see. Any responses? And Justin, feel free to answer if you know how many routes there are. If the school was here.
Someone said 2.
Okay, so we've got one here, right? So we can go across and down. We can actually also go down and across. So they're your two routes, great. But what about if we want to go across and down and across? So in actual fact, there are 3 routes to this particular one. Now, let's just have a look if the school was actually here. So I'm going to give you an opportunity just to trace with your fingers on the screen. Oh, I can see there's a lot of responses on the chat. Wonderful. Okay. A variety, 2, 4, 3. Wonderful. I like how there's a variety of different explanations. So if I can only go to the right and I can only go down, how many routes would it take here to get to school? And what do we have? This is similar to the other one. Yes, 3. Yes, 3. So if we use our fingers to trace, we can actually go across and down. We can go down, across, down, or we can go all the way down and across. Okay, so here is the challenge question. What about if the school was here? So I'm just going to give you a minute to use your fingers to trace. How many routes would we have to school if school was placed here? And is there, I think I can see something in the chat box. Let's see. Okay, it looks like unanimous. Lovely to see you, Desmond, by the way. Yep, 6. Okay, so if we traced all the different routes, we would have 6. Now, let's zoom out a little bit and have a look at if the school was actually placed at different positions on the actual grid. If you were doing this with your students, I really encourage you to spend some time and invest some time to get them to explore and inquire, to look at the different routes for the different positions of school. But here, just to save you some time, I'm going to give you the different routes for the different positions for school here. And so we worked out 10 before. And if I gave you time, you would be able to work out that there were 10 routes here if the school was here, and there are 10 routes here. Now, what's so special about these routes to school? If we were to turn this 45 degrees, you can see this beautiful pattern of triangles, which you may recognize as Pascal's triangle, right? Which we know as Pascal's. Let me just leave that up there. And this was named after Blaise Pascal, but in fact, there is evidence to suggest that the Chinese discovered this long before Pascal. The Chinese mathematician Jia Xiang devised the triangular representation in the 11th century, and his triangle was further studied and popularized by the Chinese mathematician Yang Hui in the 13th century. And so in China, we actually call this the Yang Hui triangle, and this is what I'm going to be calling it for the rest of this session. So we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the fascinating patterns of the Yang Hui triangle. Now, what is so fascinating? Well, why are we interested in this triangle in particular? There are actually amazing patterns that we can see in this triangular array. Firstly, if we have a look at these particular numbers here, so 1, 3, 6, 10, and we arrange them in using dots, these numbers, you can see that they form a triangle, and we actually call these triangular numbers. And that's kind of just fascinating to see that within, integrated within Yang Hui's triangle. If we have a look at the next diagonal row, so let's go back and have a look at the next diagonal row of 1, 4, 10, 20, and 35. If we were to arrange these into dots, you would actually form tetrahedrons. And tetrahedrons are they have 4 faces, 4 vertices, and these are called tetrahedral numbers. So going back to our Yang Hui triangle here, there are also some other fascinating things about this triangle. So far we've seen triangular numbers emerge, we've seen tetrahedral numbers emerge, but there is a whole branch of mathematics that's actually called combinatorics, and we're going to look at that in a little while. But first, let's just have a look at the sum of each row. I would like you to think about just adding those numbers up. And what do you notice about the sum of each row? Feel free to put it in the chat box. And I know we have some mathematicians here with us this morning. What's really interesting about the sum of each row? So I start with 1. Yes, they're all powers to the 2 of 2. We have 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. So the sum of each of these rows ends up being a power of 2. Now, something else that's really interesting is if we actually look at the numbers, if we have a look at 11, 121, 1,331, what are those numbers? And here's a little hint. What is 11 to the power of 4? So what do you notice about the actual digits in each row? What's the pattern that you see there? What is 11 to the power of 4? We'll find that 11 to the power of 4 is actually 14,641. Isn't that just amazing that the digits actually end up being powers of 11? Okay, so I talked about combinatorics before. Let's go into the area of combinatorics. So this is a whole branch of mathematics, which is to do with different combinations. So if I were to give you 5 colors and you had a choice of choosing 3 colors out of those 5 colors, you would actually have 10 different combinations. So let's just see where that is. And in mathematics, those 10 different ways that you can choose 3 colors from 5, we actually have some notation called 5C3. And this leads us into the whole area of combinatorics and looking at different combinations. Now, another application to this triangle is to do with binomial theorem. Binomial is just a word in algebra that roughly means when you add 2 things together. And the binomial theorem refers to the pattern of coefficients. So that means the numbers in front of the variables that appear when a binomial is multiplied by itself a certain number of times. So if we have a look here, we've got the binomial is squared. The coefficients of that are 1, 2, 1, which represents this row. And if we cube the binomial a plus b, the coefficients of each term when we expand it end up being 1, 3, 3, 1, and so on. So it's quite remarkable that these numbers in Yang-Hui's triangle actually represent the coefficients of a binomial expansion. But there's actually more. Another application is to do with binomial distributions. And this is when you have a scenario where there are 2 possible outcomes. Let's say if you flip a coin and you can get a head or tail. Now, if I was to flip a coin twice, how many heads could I get if I was to flip a coin twice? So I could actually get 2 heads. There's once that I could do that. I could actually get a head or a tail or a head. There are 2 different groups that I could get that scenario, or I could actually get no heads. And notice how the 1, 2, 1 groups of how many heads I can get relate to the row here, 1, 2, 1 as well. And so there are lots of implications for binomial distributions and scenarios where we can have 2 outcomes. Now, there is still icing on the cake to this Yang-Hui's triangle. I've color coded certain numbers on a diagonal. And so you can see that I've colored 1, I've colored 1, 1, and then the 2 ones in blue. And if I add those numbers up on this diagonal, I can generate this pattern 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. So I've got 1 plus 2 is 3. I've got 1 plus 3 plus 1 is 5. And does anyone recognize this beautiful sequence of numbers? What is this beautiful sequence of numbers? 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and 21. I'm going to give people a chance to comment in the chat box. Let me see, what did the chat box say? Beautiful, the Fibonacci sequence as well, which is a beautiful sequence that's remarkably found in many natural phenomena. Natural phenomena such as the petals in a flower. We can also easily find the numbers of the Fibonacci sequence in the spirals that are formed by individual flowers in the arrangements of daisies, sunflowers, cauliflowers, and even broccoli. Okay, so there is a cherry on the top of the icing of this cake. Another really interesting property of this triangle is that if all the positions of the odd numbers were actually shaded orange and we kept the even numbers white, this would actually form a triangle called a Sierpinski triangle. And a Sierpinski triangle is basically an infinitely repeating pattern that we know is a fractal. And if we zoom out, it actually looks like this. It's quite a remarkable, beautiful triangle. And one of my dear friends has shared this wonderful learning experience that he used with his students to engage the minds, hearts, and souls of his students. And we're just going to take a look at what he did.
Slowly, slowly, slowly. Okay? Get it into position. Okay. Where's my strips of tape? Okay. Good. Carol first on that side. Okay? Number 20. Number 20.
Isn't that beautiful? So he had his students create, you can see in these pictures, 3D versions of the Sierpinski triangle so that they could create this giant Christmas tree or this giant tree. And I think he really did truly engage the minds, hearts, and souls of his students. Now, let's just pause for a minute to allow you to digest some of the things that I've talked about so far. If you can pick up this QR code, and I'm also going to drop the URL in the chat box. What has surprised you so far about what I've said? So here in the chat box, I'm going to just drop this Mentimeter link, or use your phone, pick up this QR code, and let's go over to the Menti, see if we've got any responses. Let me know if you want me to put the QR code up again. What's been your main takeaway? What's surprised you so far? Actually, let me just go back. Yep, sorry. Go back. What's your main takeaway so far? What has surprised you? All of the patterns, it's amazing. Yes, math can be fun, believe it or not. And I'm going to talk about math can be fun a little bit. In that I think traditionally we have been exposed to a lot of algorithms and memorized formulae, facts and skills in mathematics. And sometimes we do take the fun out of mathematics. And mathematics really is a language of beauty and creativity, and how deep you can actually go in a single topic. So starting with the Yang Hui triangle, we could actually do that where in elementary easily, and we can take it all the way up to grade 12 and look at grade 12 mathematics. And so I think introducing students to that Yang Hui triangle or Pascal's triangle has so many rich learning experiences and deep conceptual understandings within that. Oh, creative way of teaching mathematics. Beautiful. The beauty and patterns, connection between patterns and the triangle and nature. Love the live application of the triangle. Exactly. So my dear friend Martin in Suzhou had that project with his students. And I think you could actually create those Sierpinski, 3D Sierpinski triangles at any age. I think at any age. In elementary, you'd probably just have some templates for students to be able to use. I think in secondary, in grade 6, you would probably introduce that idea so that students can generate those numbers themselves. Remember, we don't want to rob them of that inquiry experience. We want them to generate those beautiful numbers in the Yang Hui triangle. Yeah, many mathematical concepts are interrelated. Trying it all together, patterns lead to more patterns. Exactly. lots of patterns, tying it all together. That says integrating mathematics into Makerspace. Yes, I love that. Visuals are important. Excellent. Now I'm going to be picking up on some of the points that you've raised here as your main takeaway. So let me go back now to talk about what I'd love to share this quote actually from William Paul Thurston, who was a Field Medal recipient. He was an American mathematician at Cornell, and he basically said, mathematics is not about numbers, equations, computations, or algorithms. It is about understanding. And so I'm going to try to encourage everyone to move away from that rote memorization of algorithms. It doesn't mean that procedural fluency is not important when learning mathematics, but we want to really try and showcase the beauty, the creativity of the language of mathematics to engage the minds, hearts, and souls of our students. Now, what actually is mathematical understanding? I think that there are a few different components to mathematical understanding, and I'm going to just discuss them now. I think it really begins with a grasp of mathematical concepts, first of all. So a grasp of the fundamental mathematical concepts. Let's, for example, say ratio or proportion. They're very important mathematical concepts that have so many different contexts and actually start from pre-K to 12, I would say. We also need to understand, and somebody mentioned this on the Mentimeter, the interconnectedness of mathematical concepts. So for example, geometry and algebra are actually deeply connected and should be taught together and not in isolation. We actually need to know more than just isolated facts and skills and procedures. And it's using those facts and skills to provide a foundation for deep conceptual understanding. What else is mathematical understanding? I think knowledge is learned with understanding, and it provides that foundation for remembering and reconstructing facts and skills. And it also gives us the ability to apply and transfer to new and unfamiliar situations. So for example, if students thoroughly understand whole number operations, they should be able to extend these conceptual ideas and procedures to operations involving decimals if they really do understand. And ultimately, mathematical understanding involves pattern seeking and allowing our students to form their own generalizations through pattern seeking. Okay, so, we've really experienced unprecedented times in 2020. And I'd like to turn our conversation now to what happened during COVID and to take a look at this glass. Do you see this glass as half full or half empty? And I'd love to know your responses. So please feel free to put in the chat box. How do you see this glass? Is this glass half full or half empty? Both. I like that. Both. Okay. And I'm going to ask people to justify why. Both, depending on your point of view. I like that answer. It's full. Okay. So if you put full or both, feel free to put a justification why. So for example, why is it full? Or why is it both? Interesting to see people's thinking. It's full because it has air and water. I love that perspective. Half full of water, half full of air. Beautiful. And water and air actually are very important elements that are important to human beings, right? So I love that perspective. And it is all about perspective. But I'm so glad that people didn't say this is half empty and focus on what we've lost. I would like to pose the question, what have we gained during this time? I know that we have experienced tremendous loss, of course, but what are some of the silver linings that we could actually focus on? So what are some of the things that we have gained that have engaged our hearts? And I'm just going to check the chat box because I saw something pop up. Primary students, yes, who have become IT specialists. Exactly. Okay, so what are some of the things that we gained during this global pandemic? I think the pandemic has stimulated innovation and created distance learning solutions at a rapid rate that we could not have dreamed of. I think that, you know, we also saw, I think the pandemic has also brought about the cancellation of many standardized tests. And this has actually created more opportunities for authentic assessment opportunities. And I think that that is something that we've definitely gained. I also saw more professional learning opportunities that were not only affordable, but so many were offered free. And I also witnessed so much collaboration amongst educators in the world. I think there's been an enormous sharing of resources and ideas, and it's just been wonderful to have a space, especially on social media, to go to where you can actually share ideas about how to cope with the current circumstances. I think students have learned how to be more resilient, and they've actually also learned how to be more self-regulated, which developed their independent skills as well. And I think that that's the goal of education, to try and prepare our students for the future, for the 21st century, and to be positive contributing citizens to the world. And so our students, I think, have become more resilient, self-regulated, and independent. And because of time constraints, teachers had to really think about the most relevant and important content that they were going to cover with their students. Because if they did not, their students would actually be not engaged and unmotivated in this virtual environment. And so content became more relevant, and teachers had to really distill what content they were going to cover with their students. Now, let's celebrate some of the ways that you have engaged the minds, hearts, and souls of your students. I think it's important to pause and celebrate what we have just been through and the lessons that we've learned and what we do to engage our minds, hearts, and souls of our students. So pick up this QR code. This is exactly the same link as well. And I'm going to go through. Yep, family time. Great. Thank you, Catherine, for putting family time and parents understanding more day to day. Let me go to the Mentimeter and activate that so that we can see and celebrate some of the ways that you have engaged your students' minds, hearts, and souls. So what are some of the ways that you have engaged your students' minds, hearts, and souls? Beautiful. Make relationships a priority. I couldn't agree more that that sense of belonging and connections with your students and with each other has been so important. Use of household items to teach geometry. I love that idea. By creating videos and ways to share hands-on creations digitally. Beautiful. These are wonderful ways, I think, to engage your students' minds, hearts, and souls. And I think we've had to be quite creative during this time as well, because your students could actually choose not to be online and not to attend your lesson during this time. So what ways did we incentivize our students to come to our lessons? Encouraging student ownership over their work by being their greatest cheerleader. I love that, being really supportive of every every part of thinking, every contribution that they make. Yeah, using breakout rooms on Zoom to collaborate in small groups. I think that that's fundamental and really important. Using Google Jamboard, a tool that allows students to share their ideas. I love that as well. Okay, so thank you for those. Thank you. I think it's important for us to celebrate the different strategies that you've used as well to engage your students' minds, hearts, and souls. Now, There are some lessons that I've learned during this time as well. I've had to teach online my students at Hong Kong University, and also I have the privilege of collaborating with educators in my partnerships from different parts of the world. And there are many lessons that I've learned during this time, and I'd like to share some of these lessons with you. The first lesson I learned was with students to really move away from the focus on algorithms and let students and teachers explore, inquire into mathematical concepts, and to give them that time and space in the virtual environment. And that might mean either synchronously or asynchronously, really utilizing that affordance of asynchronous learning so that your students can have that time and space to explore and inquire into mathematical concepts. I also learned the hard way to talk less in my live synchronous sessions, because I found that, when I talked more, let's say for 15 minutes, my students would often disengage, turn their cameras off, and I wouldn't even know if they were there or not. And so I had to use, like the other suggestion that a teacher gave, breakout rooms very often and frequently, either a think, pair, and share, or using small groups and giving them the opportunity to discuss the different prompts that I had, and then asking them for feedback. Another lesson I had was to use visualization, which another teacher has brought up this morning as well, and to provide scaffolding and prompts when appropriate. We're going to actually look at some visualization examples for different mathematical concepts a little bit later in this talk. My next lesson was to preserve the inductive teaching approach. Now, inductive teaching means giving your students the opportunity to create and articulate their own generalizations. Because in the words of George Polya said, mathematics has two faces. It is the rigorous science of Euclid, but it is also something else. Mathematics presented in the Euclidean way appears as a systematic deductive science. But mathematics in the making appears as an experimental inductive science. And we want our students to be put in that situation where they are creating their own mathematical understandings, connections on the concepts, and using that inductive approach will really help them to generalize and to deeply understand. Now, the inductive teaching approach also follows the CRA or CPA model, which stands for concrete, either representational, pictorial, or abstract. And we know that Singapore mathematics education has experienced great success using this model to help learners deeply understand mathematical concepts. So we start with something concrete. We use visuals, representational pictorials based on those manipulatives. And then we actually ask our students to generalize and to abstract. Now, what is an example of the CPA or CRA model? Well, my story begins with a camel ride in the deserts in Dubai. Now, this is actually a true story as opposed to my story about Sam, the taxi driver, which was partly true. So I was very fortunate to be working with a school in Dubai a couple of years ago, as you can see, and I had a spare day when I could explore the deserts. So I'm riding on this camel in the desert, and as you can see in this picture, I started seeing and looking at all the sand dunes in the ditches as the camels were going through. And I began to think about what they represented. So I could see that one sand dune and one ditch could fill and form something flat. And then I could see that two sand dunes in a ditch, and one of the sand dunes in a ditch would fill, and it would just leave one dune. So what about these three scenarios? I'm going to give people just an opportunity in the chat box just to look at the visual. And what would we end up with if we had this particular scenario? So we've got a couple of ditches, a dune, three ditches, and another dune. Looking at the visual, what would we end up with? And please feel free to have a look at the second one and the third one. I'm going to get the chat box up just to see what's people's thinking here. So for the first one, we've got the two ditches and the dune. They'll fill each other. So that's going to cancel each other out, right? And then here we've got that one, this particular dune and this ditch I cancelled. So we end up with two ditches. And I like how somebody's jumped to the symbols, those Hindu Arabic symbols that we use as -2. Or the mathematicians here have jumped to that abstract using symbols of -2, -1, and +1. Now, if we were doing this, depending on the grade level, we would actually stay with the visuals and see how quick and easy we can look at the visuals to get what we end up with. Okay, so here are 4 more, just for fun. So what do we have here? How many dunes, how many ditches for these 4? And I'm sure that just by looking at these visuals, and you can see how the ditch and the dune fill each other, that it was so much more efficient than if I said to a student, -2 + 2 -3 + 1. I think that that may take them some time to think about, right? So the power of visualization is really important. Thank you, Desmond, by the way, for symbolizing that. Excellent. Okay, so dunes and ditches, I think, is an example of the power of visualization, which I think can be used to support deep mathematical conceptual understanding about positive and negative numbers. Now, let's just take it one step further and talk about the opposite and use that word opposite. So what is the opposite of 2 dunes? For example, what is the opposite of that? Feel free to put it in the chat box. What's the opposite of 2 dunes? What would that be? Beautiful. 2 ditches. Exactly. So we have 2 ditches, right? If that was a visual, or if we wanted to symbolize that, we know that that would be -2. Okay, let's have a look at this one. What is the opposite of 2 dunes? And feel free to either visualize the picture. So the opposite of 2 dunes. What would that be? And I have my chat box open. 2 dunes, exactly, because we're taking the opposite of the opposite. So we've got the opposite of the opposite. And if we say to students -2, that seems quite abstract. And to ask them to memorize that minus and a minus makes a plus makes no sense whatsoever. And I think that that word opposite is really underutilized in mathematics. So using that idea of the opposite of the opposite. Yep, 2 dunes. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Desmond. Okay, so let's get back to those lessons that I was talking about earlier. So I've talked about giving our students the opportunity to inquire and explore, to try to talk less, to use the power of visualization, and to use the inductive teaching approach, which aligns with the CRA or CPA approach. Now, I think that we should be valuing the process of learning and not just valuing the product. I think very often in mathematics, we focus on the grades, quizzes, and results. And it's important that we collect evidence of student learning during the process. And I think that we can use this by using live editable digital tools to see student thinking, like how someone suggested using the Google Jamboard or Padlet, or even just a Google slide, or something on OneDrive, whichever tool that you can use as a live editable collaboration tool. I think that we also need to value the collaborative approach to problem solving. So I encourage everyone to frequently put your students into pairs so that they have a thought partner, a study buddy, or small groups to discuss and solve problems together, because that's authentically what mathematicians do. Mathematicians actually collaborate together and solve problems together. Now, another lesson is to really try and be more learner directed. And that means maybe asking students to create their own problems after you've already modeled the process. And I think that this will encourage more personalization. And a lot of research, current research that's been released from the pandemic has suggested that the most successful learning has been when teachers have employed personalized learning and incorporated that into their lessons. And I think lastly, we need to be giving our students more open problems so that there are different pathways, different methodologies, and different possible answers. So not just giving our students a closed answer with one correct answer and a wrong answer. So giving those opportunities for that divergent thinking with our students. So coming back then to our glass, I'm glad that a lot of people said, a few people said it was half full of water, half full of air. I'd like to encourage us to really look at the perspective of what did we gain during this very challenging time for the world and not focus on what we lost. Now, I'd like to leave you with a quote from my late great father who actually said, "Knowledge is boundless. There is an end for life, but not for learning." And I hope that you will join me in the journey to engage the minds, hearts, and souls of our students by transforming pedagogy to transform learning for your students and ultimately transform education. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm really looking forward to engaging in some dialogue through questions and answers, which I hope that Justin's going to help me with.
Yep, I'm right here. So just drop your questions into the chat and I'll ask them. So first question is from Graham. Have you noticed if there's any particular age when the majority of students lose interest in maths? And if so, why is this?
Yes, I think that's a great question because, yes, I have noticed students lose interest. Elementary teachers, I call multi-talented. They're generalists that actually have multi-talents and they really know how to engage students, I think, with mathematical ideas and concepts because of the manipulatives that they use, because of the different types of instructional strategies as well. But for some reason, when students come to middle school and high school, the approach to mathematics tends to completely change. And I think it's so important that we still keep the manipulatives, that we keep the hands-on approaches, and that we still give our students time and space to explore and inquire. And I know a lot of teachers in secondary say, but we've got so much content to get through, you know, we don't have time. And I think, again, that is a matter of perspective. So just like the glass is half full of air and half full of water, it's a matter of perspective about how much time you want to invest in deeply engaging your students' minds, hearts, and souls, and whether you want them to be motivated and to actually nurture a love of learning for the language of mathematics and to see the beauty and the creativity of mathematics. I think to a certain extent, yes, I think that exams are handcuffs on us, they bound us, right? But I'm excited to hear some of the innovations when it comes to standardized testing and exam boards. I know that in the UK, they've cancelled their national exams at both GCSE and A level. And it'll be interesting to see what other exam boards are going to do during this year. And so I'm hoping that there's going to be a huge shift in the assessment model for standardized testing so that teachers are actually then given more time and space to explore with their students and help cultivate that love of mathematics. So thanks, Greg. Great question.
I have a question actually. Earlier in your presentation,
Sure.
you were talking about how geometry and algebra should be taught together. I mean, oftentimes that's not the case in schools. And I wonder if you have examples of curriculum systems, whether country level or individual schools, where they're doing a good job of rethinking how mathematics instruction is constructed at a curriculum level to better engage students with material.
I think the entire world is moving towards a more integrated approach when it comes to mathematics. So traditionally, there are some systems where they teach, a year of algebra, a year of geometry, but even the Common Core has suggestions to actually follow an integrated approach where we combine the topics of, let's say, number, data handling, algebra, and geometry. And so many systems actually naturally have an integrated approach. I know Hong Kong has an integrated approach. The UK has an integrated approach, and many of the European systems also have an integrated approach. But it's just ensuring that we showcase that integrated approach with our students. So even though we might, for example, teach fractions, decimals, and percentages separately, it's teaching that together, but let's say in the context of data handling. So collecting data, but putting it into the different forms of fractions, decimals, and percentages so that we understand the context of why we use those different forms of number. So it's, I suppose, being more purposeful about it, even though I would say most systems around the world do have integrated standards and recommend integrated standards.
Thanks, Jenny. Just a reminder to anyone that's connected, you can post questions in the chat box. So just at the bottom of Zoom, there's a Q&A or a chat box area where you can post questions. So if you have any questions, just drop them in there. I have a question here as well, and that's just, do you have any resources, Jenny, that you can share with the audience in terms of what their next steps would be after this talk?
Yeah, there are so many. So where should we start? I think for teachers, if you're a teacher, it's probably, you probably want fish, right? Even though we try to help you to fish and to catch your own fish, I think it's important that we give you some fish, see some concrete examples of what teaching for deep conceptual understanding looks like. And there are some wonderful websites. So inquirymaths.co.uk, or it might be .com, by Andrew Blair has a lot of wonderful prompts, and he has elementary and secondary prompts. I'm, of course, a huge fan of Enrich from Cambridge University. And so there are websites where we can look at concrete examples of learning experiences and start there. But I'm hoping that once we are familiar with learning experiences and resources given by other people, that we can actually start thinking and designing what learning experiences we want to give our students by using that inductive teaching approach and adopting that CPA, CRA approach, starting off with something concrete, manipulatives, and then really asking your students to articulate and create their own generalizations after they've looked at patterns and putting them in that situation of pattern seeking.
That's great. And then one last question here, unless someone else posts a question in the chat, and I think it's very relevant, is there a way we can re-engage adults who have lost interest in mathematics at school, or are they a lost generation?
Oh, I think that's a beautiful question, because I am actually running courses on trigonometry. And initially, they were actually designed for teachers to teach trigonometry. But we found, so we're up to our third or fourth cohort, we had a group of teachers that, well, they weren't teachers. We just had a group of adults that just wanted to come and relearn what trigonometry was. And I thought that that was wonderful. So there are a lot of, I'm sure, MOOCs that are available. I offer courses just on different mathematical topics. And even though they're designed for teachers, you can come and learn yourself. And some of the shifts in thinking have been, I wish I'd learned trigonometry this way because this completely makes sense. And there's actually a beautiful human story to trigonometry. And so I can recommend some courses, either on Coursera or any kind of MOOCs, or lots of platforms will have, wonderful courses so that we can actually try and captivate or help you relearn, the mathematics in a way that will engage your mind's heart and soul.
Thank you very much. I think there's probably a lot of parents who have rediscovered math during this period of COVID, helping their kids at home, that's for sure.
Definitely.
So I just want to thank Jenny again for the highly engaging talk today, and just say to everyone that's joined, thank you very much, and hope to see you in other sessions during the next 2 weeks of the conference. And have a good morning. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Take care and see you soon.